Good afternoon. How are we all on this very hot Sabbath? Now, there's a handout to go with this, so they're being handed out at the moment for you to follow along with, and just for your reference later. And while that's happening, I'll give a bit of a shout out to the people in Townsville and all other places there on the webcast. Okay, good to go. Now, have you ever known someone with so much talent and potential who squandered that talent and potential? Well, one of the quintessential examples of someone like this that we read about in the Bible was the mighty Samson. Now, he was physically the strongest man in the world, yet the story of his life is one full of foolish mistakes. He was a man who could have accomplished so much more good if he was just as mighty spiritually. Now, in the sermonette time today, I'd like to go through a quick overview of the life of Samson and pull out three very simple lessons that we can learn from his story. Now, in each of these lessons we'll look at, Samson's example to us is an example of things not to do. Now, before we dive into the story, let's set the scene with a little bit of background information. Now, Samson was one of the last judges in Israel before the Israelites eventually asked God for a king like the rest of the nations. Now, Samson lived around about 1100 BC, about a century before King David. Now, those who try and work out the chronology of the book of Judges believe that a number of the later judges ruled parallel to each other. Now, around the same time as Samson, Eli was likely judge in Shiloh in the central mountains of Israel. And another famous Bible character, who probably also lived about the same time, was Ruth in the south of Israel in Bethlehem. Now, Samson's family was from the town of Zorah, which is about 23 kilometres west of Jerusalem. Now, Zorah was about halfway between the Mediterranean coast and Jerusalem in the southern mountains of Israel in the Sorek Valley. Now, the valley of Sorek in the Shephelah, or the foothills, between the coastal plain where the Philistines were, and you can see their 5 main cities circled here in blue, and the hill country where Jerusalem was in the east. Now, the distance between the coast and Jerusalem is only about the same distance between here and the Gold Coast, so it's a relatively compact, small country. Now, here is a close-up of the Sorek Valley. Now, Sorek, where Samson came from, is circled in the top right. The town in the bottom right is Beth Shemesh, where the cows on their own took the Ark of the Covenant to when it was returned by the Philistines in Samuel's time. Now, Beth Shemesh means house of the sun, and Samson's name is actually quite similar to this and means man of the sun or sun-like. Now, the town circled on the left here is Timnah, where Samson's first wife came from. Now, Delilah, we'll see later, was also from the same valley, the valley of Sorek. Now, let's go to the start of Samson's story, which is at the beginning of Judges 13. Now, the story of Samson is told to us from Judges 13 through to Judges 16. Now, the main events are noted on the first page of the handout that we've had passed around, and the 3 key lessons that we'll look at today are on the back of the handout. Now, starting in verse 1 of Judges 13, we read, "And the sons of Israel did evil again in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord delivered them into the hands of the Philistines 40 years. And there was a certain man of Zorah, of the family of the Danites, whose name was Manoah, and his wife was barren and did not bear. And the angel of the Lord appeared to the woman and said to her, Behold, now you are barren, and you do not bear. But you shall conceive and bear a son. And now please take heed, and do not drink wine nor strong drink, and do not eat any unclean thing. For lo, you shall conceive and bear a son, and no razor shall come upon his head, for the child shall be a Nazarite to God from the womb, and he shall begin to deliver Israel out of the hand of the Philistines." Now, Samson's birth was a miracle, as his mother was barren until God performed a miracle. Now, God had a specific purpose for his life, to be a deliverer of Israel out of the hand of the Philistines. Now, in the rather politically correct 10-part series, The Bible, that showed a few years back, I was left shaking my head that Samson and his family were portrayed as a black family. Now, we are plainly told here that Samson's family was not descended from the mixed multitude that came out of Egypt, but were from the tribe of Dan, whose original southern territory was between the coast where the Philistines were and the tribe of Judah. Now, we're also told here that Samson was to be under a lifelong Nazarite vow. Now, the conditions of a Nazarite vow are found over in Numbers chapter 6. Now, the tribe of Levi was dedicated to God to serve the tabernacle and to teach the people. Now, a Nazarite vow was not restricted to Levi, nor was it restricted to men. A man or woman, as it says in Numbers 6 verse 2, could voluntarily for a time dedicate themselves to God, though in Samson's case, God handpicked him to be a Nazarite for life. Now, there are three main outward signs of one who is a Nazarite. Now, the first was not to drink wine or alcohol. Now, this symbolised not allowing anything to impede one's judgment as they serve God in a special way. The second was not to touch anything that had died, symbolising avoiding anything that might defile us. And the third main condition was not to cut one's hair. Now, this symbolised being in direct submission to God. Now, Jesus, we're told, was from the town of Nazareth and was called a Nazarene, and he is mistakenly thought of as a Nazarite, hence the long hair in Catholic and Protestant paintings of him. Now, a Nazarene is different from a Nazarite. Nazarene comes from a word meaning branch or shoot. Nazarite means separate. Now, Jesus was not a Nazarite as he didn't fulfill the first condition of the vow, as he regularly drank wine, including at the Passover. Now, as the story of Samson progresses, we'll see how he breaks each of the conditions of his Nazarite vow. Now, Samson was married at least once and possibly twice. Now, let's now look at how he went about choosing these women. Now, we read about the first one in Judges 14. From verse 1 we read, "And Samson went down to Timnah and saw a woman in Timnath of the daughters of the Philistines. And he came up and told his father and his mother and said, I have seen a woman in Timnath of the daughters of the Philistines. And now get her for me for a wife. And his father and mother said to him, Is there no woman among the daughters of your brothers or among all my people that you go to take a wife of the uncircumcised Philistines? And Samson said to his father, Get her for me, for she pleases me very much. Now, God's purpose for Samson is to deliver Israel from the Philistines, and yet here he is fraternising with the Philistines. God had commanded Israel not to marry someone of any of the Gentile nations in Deuteronomy 7, yet Samson ignores God's law on this point. And when his parents try to reason with him to stick with marrying an Israelite woman, Samson stubbornly insists on his own way. We see here that's all about what he wants. Get her for me, for she pleases me. Now, we'll come back a little while and see how this first marriage came to a sad end. Now, Samson was probably quite young when he married, since he asked his parents to arrange the first marriage. Now, Samson judged Israel for 20 years, and there was about this amount of time before he had another relationship with the infamous Delilah. Now, Delilah is never stated as being his wife, and he more than likely had a de facto relationship with her. It is also not explicitly stated that Delilah was a Philistine either. Matthew Henry, in his commentary, states, whether she was an Israelite or a Philistine is not certain. If an Israelite, which is scarcely probable, she had the heart of a Philistine. Now, Delilah is also usually portrayed as a sophisticated city girl, but she lived in the same valley that Samson came from. She is not even mentioned as being from one of the towns in the valley, so it's quite likely that she's a country farm girl. Now we read about Delilah in Judges 16, starting in verse 14. And it happened afterwards, he loved the woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah. And the lords of the Philistines came up to her and said to her, lure him and see where his great strength lies, and by what means we may prevail against him, so that we may tie him to afflict him. And each one of us will give you 1,100 pieces of silver. And Delilah said to Samson, please tell me where your great strength lies, and with what you may be bound to afflict you. Now Samson's first wife had her and her family threatened to convince her to get Samson to tell her the answer to a riddle so they could win a bet with Samson. Delilah, on the other hand, had no such defence. She was offered money and she betrayed Samson in a heartbeat. She was not a woman of good character. So why was Samson drawn to this woman? We read just prior to him falling for Delilah that he'd spent the night with a prostitute. Now, Samson wasn't drawn to women because of their character, but drawn to them because to please his eyes and the desires of the flesh. Now, in today's terms, he probably would have been labelled as a womanizer. Now, Delilah was probably a very physically attractive woman. Samson probably looked at her and took one look at her and said, my, Delilah. Now, a good-looking woman can turn out to be a real thorn in the flesh if she doesn't have good character to go with the looks, just like Delilah ended up hurting Samson in a devastating way, which brings us to the first key lesson from Samson's life. Choose a wife or a husband wisely by choosing someone with good character. Use your head and don't just follow your feelings or your hormones, as Samson did when choosing a wife. Choose someone who has committed themselves to God and his way of life. Now, for our second key lesson, let's look at Samson's long pattern of poor choices in his life. Now, I'll paraphrase the story starting from Judges 14. Now, Samson, against his parents' advice, we saw, chose a Philistine woman from Timnah to marry. Now, as Samson goes back to Timnah with his parents, he wanders off from his parents, where he's met by a lion, which he just tears apart very easily. Now, we don't know if this is the first time that he realises he has a superpower of supernatural strength from God. Now, if it is, you'd think he'd question, well, where did that come from? And that if God had given him this great gift of strength, then God might require some more obedience from him in return. Now, he goes back to Timnah later to marry the Philistine woman. Now, on the way back, he goes to the scene of his tearing the lion apart. Now, bees in the lion's carcass have made some honey. Now, Samson reaches in and partakes of the wild honey. So now he's broken one of the conditions of his Nazarite vow by touching a dead body. Now, as part of the wedding festivities, Samson organises a feast. Now, the Hebrew word here for feast in verse 10 is mishta, which means a drinking banquet. Now, given his cavalier attitude already to his Nazarite vow and his selfish insistence on marrying a non-Israelite, it is highly likely that he is partaking of the wine at the feast, which would have also broken his Nazarite vow. Now, at the wedding feast, Samson makes a bet with the Philistines involving a riddle. Out of the eater came forth food, and out of the strong came forth sweetness. Now, unable to figure it out, the Philistine men threaten Samson's wife with harm to both her and her family if she doesn't find out the answer. I mean, these Philistine friends of Samson are a real piece of work, aren't they? Now, Samson's wife, under duress, complies and gets the right answer for them. Now, Samson knows that they've cheated by working his wife over when he states that they have ploughed his heifer. Now, in a selfish fit of rage, Samson then kills 30 random Philistines in Ashkelon for their garments to pay off the bet. Now, the wedding feast was at Timnah, And whichever way he goes down to Ashkelon, he has to go through 2 other Philistine cities to get there, so it makes it all the more strange. Now, because he's sulking over losing the bet, he doesn't even try and go back to his wife for some time, as he then goes back to his parents' place. Now, in Judges 15, Samson eventually goes back to see his wife, but is met by her father, who thought he hated her, having abandoned her for some time, and he tells Samson that he gave her as a wife to another man. Now, after rejecting the father's offer to give him his other daughter, Samson is enraged with the Philistines and destroys their crops by fire, by catching foxes and tying firebrands to their tails and letting them go into the fields. Now, the men of Judah confront Samson over what he's done and the possibility of retribution by the Philistines on Israel. Now, they've already killed Samson's ex-wife and her father, and Samson agrees to be bound and handed over to the Philistines. Now, at Lehi, when confronted by the angry Philistines, Samson breaks loose from his cords and kills 1,000 Philistines with the jawbone of a donkey. Now, even in that great feat of killing so many Philistines, he has again broken his Nazarite vow by touching a dead body with the donkey's jawbone. Now, he's lost his wife, killed over 1,000 men, and is a wanted man amongst both the Philistines and even his own people. The whole situation has become an awful mess because of the immature, childish way that Samson reacted to losing a bet and the misunderstanding that he created by walking away from his wife for a time, which are problems that he created that he then takes no ownership for. Now, in addition to his lack of control with his sexual desires, he shows no control over his selfish anger. He constantly reacts on his feelings and rarely follows the lead of God's Spirit, completely ignoring how God would want him to act and to treat others. Now, his great strength greatly magnified the damage that he was able to cause. Now, it's very true what Uncle Ben said in Spider-Man when he said that with great power comes great responsibility. So our second key lesson from Samson's life is to follow the lead of the Holy Spirit. Don't ignore it or resist God's way like Samson, who most of the time followed the lusts of his flesh and did things his own way and created a big mess in his personal life, which gets even bigger after he allows himself to be betrayed by Delilah. Now, after the incident where he killed 1,000 Philistines in Judges 15, verse 16, Samson says, "With the jawbone of a donkey, I have killed 1,000 men." Now, it sounds like there might have been a bit of ego here, claiming the credit and not acknowledging God for his beating the Philistines. While initially there may have been some of that, he soon thereafter acknowledges that God gave him the deliverance a couple of verses later as he asks for water, which God supernaturally provides for him. Now, in spite of his sins, Samson has dealt a major blow, firstly to the Philistines' economy by destroying a good portion of their crops, and secondly, he has dealt a blow to their manpower that they would use for war by killing 1,000 Philistines. The Philistines' hold on Israel has probably weakened for a time as they regroup from the losses that Samson dealt on them. Now, at the end of Judges 15, it says that he then became a judge or leader in Israel for 20 years. Now, when we get to the events of the next chapter, Judges 16, some 20 years later, Samson is probably about 40 years old. Now, one would think that Samson would have grown up a bit emotionally and matured with age and the extra responsibility. But when we pick up the story again in Judges 16, Samson is still living the same selfish lifestyle. Now, the Philistines had a more urban society at this time than Israel, and Samson seems to be a bit bored with the country life in Israel. So Samson goes all the way down to the Philistine city of Gaza and spends the night with a prostitute. Now, when the Philistines find out Samson is in their city, they lie in wait to ambush him and kill him. Now, during the night, Samson rips off one of the city gates off its hinges and carries it some 40 miles or 60 kilometres from Gaza on the coast to Hebron in the southern highlands. Now you can see the route where he carried the city gate at the bottom of this map. Now to put this incredible feat of incredible strength into perspective, that is like picking up a 2-ton truck and carrying it from here at Upper Mount Gravatt to the top of Mount Tamborine, down towards the Gold Coast. I mean, that's just mind-blowing stuff. And we're not talking about something that happened in a movie like The Avengers, but something that actually happened in real life, thanks to the supernatural power that God gave to Samson. Now, rather than dumping the gate after breaking out of the city, you have to wonder if there's some ego or arrogance in Samson's great feat of carrying the gate all the way up to Hebron. Now, Samson then meets Delilah, who agrees to betray Samson after the Philistines offer a great big bag of cash. Now, Samson lies to her 3 times about where his strength came from. Now, he could have said nothing, but he chose to lie, and then, after much whining from Delilah, he reveals the source of his strength. Delilah lulls him to sleep, and the Philistines cut his hair. Now, the last condition of his Nazarite vow has been broken, and God finally withdraws his supernatural strength, and the Philistines take him away. Now, I'm sure you all know what Samson must have said to Delilah as he was being taken away. Why, Delilah? Now, it's hard to believe that he was so foolish and so slow to pick up exactly on what Delilah was up to. Now, the Philistines bind him with chains and put his eyes out. Now, it's ironic that they put his eyes out, given the problem that he had with his eyes and lust. Now, Samson's sins have well and truly caught up with him. He has lost his strength and is now a blind slave, grinding grain in a prison in Gaza, where he'd previously ripped off the city gate. Now, it's in this awful state that he is finally humbled and realises how foolishly that he has lived his life, and he turns to God. Now, the Samsons have a feast to the god Dagon to celebrate the capture of Samson. Now, some months have passed since his capture, and his hair has grown long again. Samson is brought in to be made fun of in his blind state. He asked to be guided to the pillars on which the great temple stood, and asked God to strengthen him one more time to bring the whole house down and die with the Philistines, who numbered 3,000 in the temple. Now, God answers his prayers, and the whole house comes down, and he dies with the Philistines. Now, Samson was willing in the end to give up his life to fulfill God's purpose for him to begin to deliver Israel from the Philistines. Now, the third key lesson that we can take from Samson's life is don't leave true repentance to the end of your life like Samson did. While he was reconciled to God in the end, he still suffered some horrible consequences for his sins that he could have avoided had he committed to living God's way much earlier in his life. God had a purpose for Samson's life. God saw to it that that purpose was fulfilled, even through Samson's many disobedient choices. Now, had Samson been obedient, God's purpose would have been fulfilled in a much different way. Samson probably would have led Israel to subdue the Philistines and gain the secret of iron technology from the Philistines that gave them military superiority over Israel. Now, these things finally happened a century later under King David. Now, in the faith chapter, we read the following in Hebrews 11, verses 32 to 34. For the time would fail to tell me of Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah, and also David and Samuel and the prophets who, through faith, subdued kingdoms, wrought righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouth of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword. And notice this next comment, out of weakness were made strong. Now, Samson was the strongest man in the world, physically, but for most of his life, his character was greatly weakened by Satan until God humbled him and he saw how foolish and selfish he'd been. Now, Satan loves to make strong men weak, but God loves to make weak men strong. God longs to fill us with his strength, the strength of patience, the strength of self-control, the strength of discipline and diligence, the strength of good judgment, and the strength of loving others the way that God loves us. Let us learn from Samson's mistakes and diligently seek God, who is the source of true strength in our lives.